Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for Botanical Science for Beginners. My name is Stephanie Pago, and I'm an Education Support Specialist with Pinellas County IFAS Extension at the Weeden Island Preserve Cultural and Natural History Center in St. Pete, Florida, which is the sister center to the Brooker Creek Preserve Environmental Education Center. I am pleased to be joining my friends from Brooker Creek Preserve and all of you today to share the exciting news that starting next month, Weeden Island will be collaborating with James to bring some fun webinars to our followers as well. Kicking off Thursday, April 29th at 2 p.m., we'll be hosting Bugs and Butterflies in Your Backyard, where James will introduce us to some of the insects that call our yards home. On a given Thursday every month thereafter, James will join our Cultural and Natural History Center to teach us about everything from epiphytes to commonly misidentified animals to mushrooms. In addition to James's programs with us, the Weeden Island Preserve Cultural and Natural History Center also has a number of other webinars coming up about the wildlife, habitats, and history of Weeden Island, including a special program about coyotes next Tuesday, March 30th. More information and registration for all of these programs can be found by visiting our website, www.weedenislandpreserve.org, and scrolling to the bottom of that homepage. Another great way to keep in touch with us and know what's happening at Weeden Island is to follow us on social media. Like and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. Our handle is Weeden Island Preserve, and there are also links to our social media pages on our website. I've put links to all those programs also in the chat so you can easily access them. Now back to today's webinar. The presentation portion of this program will be about an hour long with a brief break in the middle. If you have any questions during the program, please type them into the Q&A, and then James will address all of the questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for having me, James.
Thank you, Stephanie, and I hope you enjoy meeting all of our kind of frequent flyers that come and see us most Wednesdays. So thank you very much, Stephanie, and we hope to see a lot of you as we kind of broadcast from Weeden Island in the coming months. So today's presentation, Botanical Science for Beginners. Welcome, everyone. Very glad you're here. We had about 100, close to 180 people sign up. And we've got right now in the classroom, we've got about 65. And that just proves my point that when you put the word botanical in the title, people want to learn, but then they get scared and they run away. So good for you for tuning in. And I promise not to hurt you today. We're going to go through this slowly, and we're going to learn some botanical science for beginners. I am your presenter today, James Stevenson. If you have any questions that you do not feel like putting in the Q&A, which is where we're going to be monitoring the Q&A. You can hit that button and ask us a question if it doesn't present itself. You can always also drop me a line. If you think of something later on, jot down my email address here, J. Stevenson, first initial, last name, at pinellascounty.org, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So today's presentation, Botanical Science for Beginners. And according to the Oxford Dictionary of Biology, which I keep close at hand, botany is defined as the scientific study of plants, including anatomy, morphology, physiology, biochemistry, taxonomy, cytology, blah, blah, blah. That's what scares people away, and I get it. Those are some big, scary words. Let's look at it this way. Let's look at some really cool things about plants that are all around us, and some really cool stuff that we've never thought of before, and hopefully some things that will be new to us today, and that we will become closer to the plants that surround us. Does that sound more reasonable? I hope so. So to start, as far as we know as of maybe last year, there are about 400,000 different plant species. That's a lot of diversity in plants. That's a lot to sort through. They all work the same way. That's the beauty of it. It's a huge kingdom of diversity of life on Earth, but they all work the same way. Everything that makes a plant a plant. So plants have evolved into all sorts of forms, shapes, sizes, and habitats. There are land plants that came up out of the primordia, overtook the earth, and then went back into the marine systems. Plants like seagrass, that's a land plant that re-entered the water and adapted itself to living in marine systems. And if you visit Weeden Island, you can see these seagrass beds that are profoundly ecologically important to the survival of a lot of marine species, the manatees notwithstanding. Of course, our jungles are very, very vast areas defined by the plant communities that are there, extremely diverse plant communities in jungles. Somehow plants have managed to figure out how to live in areas like this. The permafrost, the tundra, the taiga areas, the frozen coniferous forests, kind of unimaginable, but there they are, adapted and thriving just fine. And here in our own Central Florida, our own Pinellas County, and our own Brooker Creek Preserve, we've got habitats like the oak hammock, defined by the plants that are found there, primarily the oak canopy. We have the pine flatwoods, defined by the major tree being the pines. We also have the flooded forest, the swamp area. So all these are habitats defined by the plants and the hydrology, with the diversity that goes along with that. And here we have Weeden Island itself, our sister preserve, as Stephanie was mentioning, down on the coast in St. Petersburg, with its plant community, primarily mangroves and the seagrass beds, plants that have adapted to those habitats and defined them. So what are plants? Well, let's go back to a scientific definition. Any member of a kingdom, we have several kingdoms of life on Earth. One of those kingdoms is the plant kingdom. Multicellular, eukaryotic, photosynthetic, lacking locomotion, no nervous or sensory organs, and cellulosic cell walls. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Otherwise, a living thing made of lots of cells that can take sunlight and turn it into sugar. That's the magic of plants. It can't move, it can't feel, and it has a very special carbohydrate cell wall. That's what a plant is. What a plant isn't are the other kingdoms. Plants are not animals. Plants are not bacteria. Plants are not protists, the single-celled amoebas and things like that, and they're certainly not fungus. Fungus is another entire kingdom of life. So fungus, wrong kingdom, another lecture for another day. So what are we going to cover today? Let's go over every single one of the 400,000 plants on Earth, shall we? How much time do we have? We'll look at the major four. You can handle four. We'll look at the four main groups of plants, and then what makes them different to one another, and then we'll see what makes those four larger groups alike. Those characteristics just laid out in that definition of the cellulosic cell wall, the special part of the cell that doesn't have anything in it, and those special organelles that turn sunlight into sugar, the magic of plants. We'll finish up with how these sedentary organisms can adapt to the environment. If you can't get up and run away from trouble, what can you do as a plant? So we've got these 400,000 different species. We need to classify them. People just do that. People have to pigeonhole things. It's just a human pastime. And so we have kind of overlaid some bits and pieces of the plant world into manageable little bits. We've compartmentalized, I think is the word that I was looking for. So we've got our trees, That's a nice chewy chunk of plant life. We've got vegetables as a group. The weeds, of course, are a very economically important group of plants. Flowers, you spend a lot of money on flowers. Invasive plants, perhaps you've heard that as a category of plants. But these aren't scientific groupings, right? These might be legitimate circumscriptions of different groups of plants, but they're not scientific because they're subjective, more or less. Some people might see a large plant and they're not quite sure if they would define it as a tree or a large shrub. One person's weed might be another person's vegetable. So it's all, you can see how that can be very, very subjective. So what we need to do is take a look at the scientific classification of plants, the botany, the reason hopefully that you've tuned in today for some botanical science. Luckily, out of 400,000, we can characterize those into 4 distinct groups, and I bet you can remember the 4. And if you can't remember the 4, I bet it wouldn't take very long to jot them down, and you could refer back to them if you need. The 4 groups of plants on Earth, on land: the mosses, the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the flowering plants. Not that hard. The mosses are very simple. They're true plants. They have no roots. They don't have real stems. They don't have real leaves. And they reproduce in this very, very ancient way by producing specialized cells, single cells that can germinate and grow. And those cells are called spores. Moving up in complexity, we have a group of plants known as the ferns, and they're distinct from the mosses in that they are vascular. They do have a vascular system. They have roots and stems. They can move their photosynthate, all that sugar that they've made, they can move it to different parts of the plant body. But they still reproduce by spores. They still have that ancient reproduction mechanism. Moving along in complexity, as plants continued to adapt to the environment and move into larger and more available niches on land, the gymnosperms appear. And in the gymnosperms, we have the vascular systems that are strong enough to allow these plants to get very, very large. The largest plants on Earth, the largest living organisms, are gymnosperms. The giant redwoods and sequoias in the west of the United States and Canada, the gymnosperms, they figured it out. They still have a rather early evolved reproductive system. They figured out seeds, but the method of fertilization and development of those seeds is still kind of rudimentary compared to the final and 4th group of plants, the flowering plants. The flowering plants have all the vascularization. They also reproduce by seeds, but their seeds are contained inside a fruit. And the flowering plants came around the same time as the insects, and the flowering plants and the insects worked together, diversified, exploded in diversity, and so most of the plants on Earth are flowering plants. So those are the 4: mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, and flowering plants. So we'll start 1, the mosses. As we mentioned, they're non-vascular and they reproduce by spores. They don't grow that large because they don't have that vascular system to move the photosynthate and the water and all these kinds of things through their bodies. They have to be kind of small. They rely on layers of rainwater or mists to build up, this sort of thing, because they can't move water around. They need access to it, kind of on a on a plane almost, and you'll find mosses growing where they have access or where moisture and rainwater and these sorts of things might last that little bit longer, and the plants can take advantage of it. The plants, as they grow and as their older body parts die and begin to decompose, can actually retain some of that moisture as well. So you'll find mosses growing, as here, in the cracks of pavers, that sort of thing. Very, very small, the mosses. The main bodies of the plants are down here with their suggestions of leaves, these little scales. And when it's time to reproduce, they form these very tall structures with a little capsule on top. And here we have the mosses being very short, very low growing, their suggestion of leaves, their photosynthetic surfaces, and then this structure that grows up produces this capsule that releases those special reproductive cells called spores. The moss life cycle, the spore, here we go, being circled, is released from that capsule, and it grows, germinates, that single cell germinates, and the cells begin to divide and grow. Those cells contain the chlorophyll that they need to photosynthesize and create the sugars, thus driving the whole organism to get larger and larger. And they grow into these kind of upright structures that you could argue look like they might have a stem and might have little leaves, little suggestions of these things. Some spores grow into male plants, and some spores grow into female plants. The female plants, on the very tip of that structure, here we have it here, and this is a drawing of the same with those scales that are like leaves, and at the very tip of the female plants, an egg cell is produced, a real egg cell. At the tip of the male plants, sperm cells are produced, real sperm cells. And in the presence of that thin layer of water, the sperm cells can actually swim towards the female plants and down in this tube to find and fertilize the egg. Once that egg is fertilized out of the top of this little plant, that's when the structure grows up out of the top of this separate plant and forms the capsule and the spores for the next generation. It's worked for mosses for millions and millions of years. That low-key, low-profile reproductive system happening where they have access to plenty of fresh water in the form of rain, mist, and so on. Our second group, the ferns, and you can probably picture ferns in your brain. And I bet most of you knew that ferns reproduce by spores, right? You probably heard that. Well, let's take a look at what that means, this second group of plants. They are vascular. That's what makes them different from the mosses. They can get bigger because they can support themselves. They can move, photosynthate the sugars and the water, all the things all around their bodies. They can hold themselves up. They're vascular. They still reproduce by spores. These are the ferns. And ferns come in a wide diversity of shapes and sizes. Some might be quite surprising. Your idea of a fern might be challenged by something like this. This is kind of one of the first attempts at fern, if you will, as far as the evolution goes, with one paddle-shaped leaf and a second leaf that's modified into this stalk, and the spores being produced on this leaf that looks like a stalk. This is one of the moonseed ferns, one of the bird's nest ferns. This could be mistaken for a flowering plant, but for the fact that on the underside of the leaves, the sporangia that produce the spores are there, and that means that they have to be a fern. You might be familiar with the staghorn fern. It's a true fern. It's got two different, very different shaped leaves. It's got one leaf that's shaped like a clasping structure that it holds on to the tree trunk where it's growing, and then a second type of leaf, one plant, two types of leaves The second type of leaf actually sticks out into the environment, and the spores are produced underneath these leaves and are released into the air. So let's take a look back at our golden foot polypotie. And here we can see the underside of this leaf, no different from the other leaves on the plant, except for the fact that it's producing these crazy dots, these regularly spaced, equally sized dots on the underside of the leaf. And at IFAS Extension, we give a lot of advice to people on their plants and problems with their plants in their garden and their landscape and so on. And every year, at least once a year, someone brings in a fern frond that has these structures underneath, and they want to know what the bug is, because suddenly these structures appeared on the leaf of their precious fern. Well, it's their reproductive structures. And if we zoom in on just one of these dots right here on one leaf of one fern, this is what that dot is made of. It's made up of about 100 of these smaller structures. These are called sporangia, and they have a zipper on them. Each one of these sporangia contain about 34 spores, and they're contained in the sporangia that has a zipper on it, so that when the spores are ripe, and here we have the one sporangia, we'll take one of these and blow it up. When the spores inside the sporangia are ripe, that zipper, here we have it in side view, bursts open, and the spores are released. So let's do the math. Each one of these sporangia has 34, 62 spores. Depending on the species, there's a specific number, but all ferns have the same sporangial structure. Do the math. Each one of these has 34 spores. Each one of these has 3,000 or more spores. You can do the math and see how many spores are produced by an individual fern frond, let alone an individual fern plant. So lots of energy is put into releasing a lot of these special reproductive spores into the environment. But once that happens, things get really weird. Leave it to the ferns. We have the spore. Here's a drawing of that sporangia. The spores are ripe. The zipper pops. The spores are released into the environment. The spore germinates, just like with the moss. But what the spore germinates into is a different plant altogether. It's not the fern that we know. It's called a gametophyte. And it's this separate plant. It's this heart-shaped plant. And on this one plant, we have special organs that produce eggs and special organs that produce sperm. And again, this very small, diaphanous, thin tissue of a gametophyte grows. And once those cells are united, that embryo grows through this plant and becomes the mature fern that we can see. You can kind of see the gametophyte, but they're wee small. Here we have a photograph, probably 10 times or 15 times magnified, and it's that heart-shaped, only 1 or 2 cell layers thick on the underside of this separate plant. Those eggs and sperm cells are being produced. They will swim out into the environment and hopefully find another one of these heart-shaped structures to fertilize. Once the egg is fertilized, it grows into the fern that we know. And here we have a little sporling, the next generation, beginning to look a little bit more like the fern that we know. Meanwhile, the gametophyte, the job is done. It's going to wither away. And the roots of this new zygote embryo are going to grow, and it's going to become an independent plant on its own and grow into the ferns that we would recognize as ferns. Group number 3, the gymnosperms. Roots, stems, leaves, mostly needles, but not exclusively needles. They have naked seeds. They don't flower, and their seeds are not contained in a fruit. It's what gives them their name, the Gymnosperm. That literally means naked seeds. They are vascular, reproduced by seeds, the Gymnosperms, and we know them primarily as this group called the conifers. That's certainly the best known of the Gymnosperms. It's certainly the ones that we are left with through the great experiment of plant evolution and the development of the seed with an embryo inside and a little bit of a packed lunch for that embryo to feed off of as the embryo develops into the mature tree. There are some others, but we won't necessarily bother with them. Let's just stick to this group that produces the cones, the most widely known. And of course, pines. You know, a pine is a conifer, I'm going to assume. Not a stretch to imagine that. There's also these strange conifers that live in the deserts of Namibia, ancient things, both as individually ancient and as a lineage, an ancient line of conifers. They're called Welwitzia, and they just have two leaves that grow from a basal meristem, like your hair. They get longer over time. And in the desert, the winds throw these leaves around, and the tips get worn off, and they eventually die away. But that's okay, because the leaves are just getting longer and longer and longer, and then shaved off by the wind. But in their life cycle, they produce cones. They are cone-bearing. They are conifers. The cycads are another of these coniferous groups. This bit of the history of the evolution of plants on land kind of getting stopped here in the cone-bearing phase. The cycads, there's several species that are still with us. And here's a female cone going through its life cycle. We probably best know the quote-unquote conifers. You go to a conifer nursery, you go to a conifer section of an arboretum, you look for a conifer for your landscape, an evergreen, all these kinds of things. Lots of diversity among the conifers as well. The cones produced by this group, these Gymnosperms, there are male cones and there are female cones. These are, of course, labels that have been given by people, and humans have, as I said, we love to classify things, and so these structures here are referred to as the male cones because they provide the pollen cells that are going to eventually fertilize an egg cell, which would be born in the female cone. So we have male and female cones. That's how we refer to these things in botanical science. And if we took one of the scales of the male cone, you can see this small thing. If we just took one of those little scales that's sticking out and looked at it side on through about, 50 magnification, you would see within that scale these special structures that look like Mickey Mouse ears. There's a Mickey Mouse ear, there's a Mickey Mouse ear, and then this dark patch. Those are all connected to each other. Those Mickey Mouse ears are wings. They don't flap. They're just diaphanous. They catch the breeze, and they carry the pollen through the air to find the female cone. And we all know about pollen flying through the air. We don't need to linger on that, I am sure. So here is a pine tree with a collection of male cones releasing that pollen into the air, hoping to find and land on a brand new female cone. And here the scales are larger. The scales themselves contain 2 egg cells, and the pollen has to find and land on one of these scales the pollen grain has to germinate and grow and find the egg cell. It's kind of like a hide and seek routine where we have the female cone. Here is one of those scales of the female cone with a swollen structure. In the base of the swollen structure, one of those little grains is an egg cell. And so the pollen grain has to land on the scale, grow and discover, fertilize that egg cell. And instead of growing into the next generation, like it does in the ferns and in the mosses, what's going to happen is a seed is going to form. As that female cone develops, and it could take up to 3 years for the development of the cone and the ripening of the seed. But on each one of these scales, if you can just see that little flake showing up on the scale there, I'll show you what's happening. This cone is opening, and what's coming out are the seeds, the naked seeds. These are seeds that are not contained in any protective coating. They just have a modified scale that their mom gave them that will send them far away from the parent plant. Good luck, good riddance. I hope you don't get eaten by a squirrel. If one of these seeds were to germinate and grow into an adult, that population is stable. Here we have that little pine nut, that little pine seed having germinated, and we have the vascular system, we have roots going down, we have leaves going up. Good luck for the future of the next generation of the conifers. Anybody need to drink some water? Get up and stretch for about 5 minutes. That's great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cast my eyes onto the Q&A. It looks like we have a couple of questions. And when I said gametophyte, is this okay. Thank you, Wayne, for your question about the fern gametophyte. Did I mean it's a different species or just a different stage of development? It is a different stage of development. In the ferns, we have an alternation of generations. We have the spore-bearing generation, the fern that we know, the fern that we can see, and we have the gamete generation, which is a separate plant that produces gametes. And once the egg is fertilized, the spore-producing generation comes up and grows. It's the same species. It's just a different stage in the development. How many trees grow pine cones? I am not sure how many different members of the Gymnosperms produce cones. It's not limited to the pines. The short answer is I don't know on that one. How many trees grow pine cones? Well, there's hemlocks that are not pines. They produce cones. There are firs that aren't pines. They produce cones. There are redwoods. There are cypress. There's all sorts. So I don't have an exact number, but it's diverse. It's not nearly, however, as diverse as the next group that we will address. Oh, here's one from Cheryl. How do we know if what we're looking at is an algae or a moss when something is growing on a tree? We saw the slide of the mosses growing on the trunks of the tree. How can you tell if it's an algae or a moss? Really, it comes down to a hand lens. I keep a little 10x hand lens. If you can make out the structures that suggest leaves, little scales, little rounded or pointed scales that are organized into these shapes, into these thin shapes, you know that you're either looking at a moss or a relative, the liverwort, which we're not going to worry about today. The algae is just going to look like some fuzz, basically. It's just a loose collection of green photosynthetic cells. If the Australian pine is not a pine, what is it? It's a flowering plant. And that's going to be the next group that we look at. I hope everyone's doing well. So, mosses, ferns, the gymnosperms, conifers. We're going to now have a look at the flowering plants. They have roots, they have stems, they have leaves, just like everyone else, reproducing by seeds contained within a fruit. Not all fruit is edible. Not all fruit is fruity. Some fruits are dry. Some fruits are prickly. Some fruits have hooks and teeth. Fruit is a botanical term that means a ripened ovary and fertilized eggs inside that are the seeds. So fruit has a botanical definition. It also has a grocery store definition. What we're going to focus on today is the botanical definition. The flowering plants, we talk about pollination other than the wind. Our conifers, there were no insects. There were no insects when the gymnosperms came about. The insects and the flowering plants around the same time. So plants took advantage of the presence of insects. Insects took advantage of the presence of flowering plants. This trade-off has led to a tremendous increase in diversity of both. And here you can see the little native bees visiting a water lily. They're busy down in there. What are they doing? They're collecting nectar. Some are collecting pollen. Some are collecting pollen to feed their children because pollen is very nutrient dense. That's not going to do the plant any good. If something else eats its pollen, it's got to be transferred. But just their action, these little native bees stumbling around inside the flower, they're going to accidentally cross-pollinate two plants as they visit them. The fruit, the insects, the flowers, all these things together have streamlined and made more efficient the pollination and the distribution of the seeds. So there are many different shapes of flowers. They're all built on the same formula. Flowering plants, huge diversity, they all boil down to the same formula and they all serve the same purpose, to present their reproductive structures to the environment to facilitate pollination, therefore the fertilization of their egg cells. Then a fruit forms to facilitate the dispersal of those ripened seeds away from the parent plant. So here we have a dish-shaped flower. And we've got the reproductive structures here in the middle, the anthers that carry the pollen, and then we have the stigma and the style, and below all that is this special ovary where those egg cells are located that will become the seeds. And a dish-shaped flower would be quite welcoming to an insect like a bee that can be kind of clumsy and could kind of come in and land on this nice broad landing strip and stumble its way towards the center of the flower where this bee is sure there's going to be a nectar reward, and inadvertently pass by the pollen-bearing structures that are eventually inevitably going to be stuck to the hairs on that bee's body and moved to another plant. Some flowers are tubular. They're just put together different in different species, in different genera, in different families. They're based on the same plan. Here we have the petals in this instance forming a tube, and we have the anthers kind of sticking out like a feather duster. And this is perfectly shaped to accommodate the presence of a nectar-seeking bird who's going to put its long bill down inside this flower to get the nectar, and accidentally going to get a little bit of pollen delivered on its head, its forehead, its mid, back of the head, somewhere it's going to be delivered this pollen and inadvertently transfer it to another flower where the stigma is going to pick it up, pollen tube's going to grow, fertilize the eggs, the fruit is going to form and disperse the seeds. Some of our flowering plants have gone back to a more traditional way of reproduction, a less energy intense way of reproducing, by not producing showy petals, by not producing copious amounts of nectar to feed and trade or bargain with the pollinators to come and visit the flowers, to inadvertently pick up the pollen, to move it to another plant. Some flowering plants have reduced their flowers into nothing more than the reproductive bits. No nectar, no petals, no fuss, no muss. Rather, tons of pollen on the male flowers. And we all know what these are. They're falling now. They're releasing their pollen into the what? Yes, into the wind. Doesn't cost a thing. All it costs is the production of pollen. Buckets, clouds of pollen can be released into the environment. The pollen being the male cells drifting in the wind to another oak tree, where this is it, folks. That is a flower. That's a flower. That's a flower with no petals. That's a flower with no stamens. This is a female flower. It only developed female parts. These flowers only developed male parts. These flowers only develop female parts. There's no petals, nothing to make it showy because the wind doesn't care. Wind is going to deliver the pollen straight onto the surface. Pollen is going to grow and fertilize the one egg inside. And if you know what kind of plant this is, and I bet some of you do, it's a tree, the female flower, the egg is going to be fertilized, and this is going to grow into the fruit of this plant. The plant is an oak tree. The fruit is an acorn, right? So here we have the ovary of the oak tree, the female flower. You can still see her little stigma. Useless now, its job is done, but it has put all of its energy into developing that one egg cell, now an embryo once it's been fertilized, into the fruit that is going to reproduce this plant. The dispersal mechanism would be animals coming and collecting this fruit and burying it. Perhaps you've grown tomatoes, and you know that the flower begins, opens, welcomes the pollinators. Once pollination has happened, the petals fall off, they're not needed anymore. The anthers fall off, their job is done. But the ovary, of course, is going to stick around and ripen and develop and grow. And inside of that ovary are the fertilized eggs that are now called seeds. So this is the development of a fruit. Flowering plants, ripened ovaries, are referred to as fruit. So yes, tomato is a fruit. And if you've grown tomatoes, here we have a longitudinal section of that tomato flower. And just to prove that I'm not making this up, I didn't draw this. I'm just telling you this. We have this ovary, a defined area of the flowering plant containing the ovules. Upon the pollen reaching the stigma area here and growing down through and pollen and fertilizing the eggs, those eggs become seeds once they're fertilized. Those seeds, once dispersed away from the parent plant, will then grow into the next generation. So here it is on a drawing scale. Another plant flowering plant. Remember, most of what you see out there are flowering plants. If they're not moss, if they're not fern, if they're not conifer, they're flowering plants. So if you're growing peanuts, peanuts produce a yellow flower. Then they have this funny habit. Once the flower has been visited by the pollinator, and once the pollen has been transferred, and once the pollen grows and fertilizes the eggs, and the eggs begin to develop into seeds, the peanut plant pushes its fruit underground for protection. And so the fruit is actually what we call a peanut. But the fact that it is a ripened ovary, a part of the flower called the ovary, it's that special part, the most important part of the flower is the ovary, that bit right in the smack in the middle. Once it's been pollinated, fertilized, it's going to shove its fruit underground, and the fruit is going to form a hard shell on the outside. Might challenge your idea of fruit, but it's how the botanists refer to fruit, the ripened ovary of a flowering plant. No matter what, that's fruit. So the mosses, the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the flowering plants. Those are the four main groups. That's what makes them different. What makes them the same? What makes all these things plants? It's down to the cellular level. And we could do cellular molecular biology. I can't do cellular molecular biology. So let's pick three easy ones that make plants plants. One, the cell wall. Plants have cell walls that are absent in the other kingdoms, except for the fungus, but fungus are like a weird, anyway, cell walls made of cellulose. Plant cells have a central vacuole, which is it's not a void, it's just a central organelle that's very large, and it allows for all kinds of metabolic processes. And most important to plant cells is that they contain chloroplast. You might have heard of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is in the chloroplast, and that's what makes the chloroplasts green. So that's what makes all these things plants, is that they have these things at the cellular level: cell walls, central vacuoles, and chloroplasts. The cell walls allow for plants to be upstanding, right? They're rigid, they're taut. The cellulose forms this kind of lattice structure that allows plants to present themselves to the sun, because that's what they need. So cellulose, on the very basic level, allowed our little moss plants to support themselves outside of water. As minimally as they do that, it's still a far cry from just being passively blobbing around in the water. Little moss plants can stand up on their own thanks to the presence of cellulose, and you multiply that up exponentially into larger and larger plants. You can see how cellulose allows for plants to get larger and larger. Cellulose is made of glucose units. It's a polysaccharide, which means many sugars, and those sugars are glucose. Cellulose is repeated chains of this, making cellulose insoluble. Cellulose is fiber. Cellulose is what people eat. A lot of people eat plants to eat the cellulose. Cellulose is put to use in a lot of different ways in plants, not just the cell walls, but plants can make cellulose. And in the case of cotton, they can produce an awful lot of cellulose fibers in the fruit. Remember, it's a ripened ovary, so here we have the fruit of the cotton plant. This fruit actually contains a lot of cellulosic fibers that facilitate the dispersal of their seeds. This cotton fluff, this cellulosic fluff, is going to catch the breeze and blow away from the parent plants. The seeds inside are pretty intricately bound to those cellulose fibers, and they're going to go with the fibers wherever the wind takes them. People have taken advantage of the fact that plants can create cellulose out of sunlight and water and create papyrus. And for humans, the creation of papyrus meant recording life, leading on to the production of paper by two different cultures, which also meant recording life, written language, art, music, all these things that needed to be put on paper, which led, of course, to books and then the printing press, and then how we became as arguably smart as we are is thanks to the fact that plants can make cellulose. The central vacuole is that it's not an empty part of the cell, but it is a big occupying force where water can be stored, where metabolic wastes can be shunted, where the concentration of different solutes can be adjusted to either cause cells to absorb more water or to lose water, as the case may be. In the absence of stored water, as the plant organs use that water up, the plants are going to show the fact that the water is leaving, and it's leaving the vacuoles, it's being used up, and plants tend to wilt until that vacuole is refilled and becomes turgid again and allows the plant to stand back up. Finally, the chloroplast. And the chloroplast is an interesting little organelle. It has all these words that are going to scare the people that don't want to deal with botanical science. So let's just rip away all the scary words and let's get down to the basics. The chloroplast is a little organelle floating around in the plant cell. So here we have a blown up little organelle floating around in the plant cell. This organelle has its own DNA. It has its very own little DNA. And these things can reproduce themselves. We can get two chloroplasts from one because they have their own DNA that code for their own little structures. And they have this thing, and I'm sorry I can't shield you from the reality that this little green hamburger is called a thylakoid. It just is. That's where the chlorophyll is. And that's where the magic happens. So this is a chloroplast inside of a plant cell. It's what makes all of our four plant groups related to each other. They have this thing in their cells, the chloroplasts. Take a look at a bacteria from another kingdom of life. We talked about plants being in their own kingdom because of the reasons that we laid out before. The fungus are in their own kingdom because they have a completely different way of living. The bacteria are in their kingdom. Their cells are put together uniquely, basically. The very first living organisms resembled what we have today as bacteria. They too have their DNA unique to them that allows them to reproduce. They too have thylakoids. Some bacteria are photosynthetic. They figured out how to capture sunlight and turn it into sugar that allow them to grow, producing their own sugar, making their own food. They don't have to eat anything else. So blue-green algae containing DNA and thylakoids, there's that word again. There's a theory that makes sense that an animal, single-celled animal, was cruising around millions and millions of years ago and ate one of these blue-green algae, just inhaled it, just sucked it in. But it didn't digest it. it kept it. And that thing kept making sugars. And suddenly it was making enough sugar to feed not only itself, but that thing that ate it. And that can be how plants got started, by ingesting photosynthetic bacteria, and then throughout the millennia, plants developed as an entire kingdom of life that overall can make their own food because of what happens right here in the chloroplast. Water comes in the presence of light, sends all these crazy chemical reactions. One of the byproducts of the first cycle is oxygen. So you've heard plants produce oxygen. Here's how it's happening. They're not making it out of whole cloth. They're taking water and breaking it up and getting rid of the oxygen from water and using the hydrogen and the carbon from carbon dioxide, knocking those two things together, the hydrogen and the carbon, the hydrogen from water and the carbon from carbon dioxide, knocking those two together into something called a carbohydrate. Have you heard of carbs? Also known as sugar. That is the magic of plants right there. It is taking sunlight and carbon dioxide, sunlight and carbon dioxide. Plants take these two things and run them through their special chloroplasts, and they produce sugar and oxygen as byproducts. And they feed on the sugar, they feed everything else in the world on their sugar, and the oxygen byproduct has led, of course, to life on Earth as we know it today. That's the magic of plants. Take a nice deep breath of oxygen and thank a plant. As you know, our clean oxygen is passed on the breeze. So we've been through the 4 major groups of plants. We looked at what all 4 of these groups have in common. Now let's see how sedentary organisms can react to the environment. Plants are stuck right where they are. So what have plants done to deal with the fact that they're stuck in place? How do they reach for the sun, for example? Plants can't move. There are plants that exhibit movements, but they can't decide to get up and go over there. All of these things have to be controlled as the result of some sort of environmental stimulus. And what triggers these movements are the actions of hormones. Perhaps you've heard of them. And hormones are triggered when light is coming from a particular source. That leads to the production of certain hormones which inform the cells on the side of the plant that is not facing the light to elongate. And when the cells on the side of the plant where sunlight is absent elongate, it causes the whole thing to bend towards that light source. Don't let this happen to your plants at home. Gravity can also be reacted to. As a young tree, this hemlock, this conifer, was just growing as well as it could in the eastern Appalachians. And the ground, this shifting shale or sandstone, collapsed from underneath it. And the tree, young tree, was kind of hanging off the side of a cliff. Gravity was detected by the cells. Hormones were secreted that informed this plant to grow longer and stronger cells on one particular side of the plant that eventually began to push the tree back to an upright position. Upright positioning is going to be the most effective to take advantage of sunlight which comes from above. So this plant's never going to stand straight up and down, but you can see it has certainly corrected that environmental cue that caused some sort of effect on its growth. So hormones, very, very important components. They pretty much regulate what happens. They're the control center of what happens within a plant. Hormones are going to react to environmental stressors or environmental signals, and they're going to code for when buds break in the spring. It might be due to temperature changes. It might be due to light level changes. It might be, in certain climates, the appearance of rain after a long dry season. An environmental cue is going to trigger the production of a hormone that is going to tell the buds that it's time to break. Hormones regulate the speed and depth of fruit ripening, stem elongation, when it's time to drop your leaves, so when is it time to break bud, when is it time to drop your leaves, the formation of tubers. That might be a seasonal thing for certain plants like the potato, to overwinter or to sit out a dry season. Loads more. Hormones coursing through plant bodies all the time. And I found this quote to be quite interesting, that hormonal mechanisms in plants and animals, and we know hormones do a lot to animals as well. It just kind of goes to show that, there is an ultimate first thing that was alive, and hormones have been these special chemicals that have been produced by living things ever since there was that very first living thing. Just shows how we're all tied together. And finally, hormones can tell certain parts of the plant that it's time to be something that you never intended to be. It is something that humans have been able to take advantage of. These are roots appearing from the stem of a plant. So in this area of growth where cells are rapidly dividing, hormones are very actively being produced, this is where a leaf was attached. That's all that this part of the plant ever really meant to be. But some environmental stressor or force or trigger told the cells in this part of the plant that it's time to stop being stem and start being root. Plant cells have these abilities. Many plant cells have the abilities to go from one job to a completely different job due to the reaction to an environmental force. So in this case, we can take cuttings. We can take a plant and chop its stem in half and stick it in the ground, and where there were supposed to be leaves, now there's roots, and we have a clone of the original plant. So that is some botanical science for beginners. I hope that that is what you tuned in for today. I'm going to stop, have a drink of water. There's a lot more to learn. We hope that you will join us. Click some of the links that Stephanie has put into the chat. Meanwhile, I'm going to get a drink of water and I'm going to peruse the Q&A. And Stephanie is going to, during all these other things, launch a really quick poll. If you wouldn't mind just taking the few seconds that it takes to answer these questions. They're easy questions, not a test. We're always looking at ways of improving our presentations. We're always looking at ideas for new presentations and so on. So as I drink, you answer questions, and all of a sudden the poll is going to disappear once about 75–80% of our viewers today have answered. I'm going to quick mute while I Thank you all for that, for answering our poll questions. And I'm going to look over here at the Q&A. And what I'm going to leave you with is my email address if you have any questions that you don't feel like popping into the Q&A. I realize I've kept you 5 minutes over, and I apologize for that. So let's take a look at some of these questions. What, if anything, does the size of the pine cone indicate? Some in my yard are small, but some are almost a foot long. Interesting. Generally speaking, for a species of pine tree, there is a given sized cone that, when mature, is going to fall within a relatively narrow range of measurement. So for a slash pine, that range of measurement might fall, in that, let's say, 7 to 12 centimeters long. So slash pine, they're generally going to have a cone that size. A different species, the longleaf pine, that species range is going to fall into more like the 20 to 30 centimeter range. So definitely much larger. You're going to find some gradations of sizes that might not quite match up. Some of that, a much smaller cone could represent a cone that has ceased its development for some reason. I did mention that it can take up to 3 years for a cone to fully ripen. An environmental force during those years could affect that cone to the point where the tree just decides to get rid of it. It's not worth the effort. This isn't going to happen. It's actually called aborting. It's just like abort mission. No more resources we're going to pour into this. We're trying to make too many cones all at once. Let's just focus on the ones that we can actually manage. So that could be one reason that smaller cones are found. The male cones, which I pointed out earlier, those are temporary. Once the pollen has been released, the job is done. They're not going to release any more pollen. Those cones fall to the ground. They look very different. I don't even know what they look like. They just look like male pine cones to me. Little orange jobs. The scales, of course, are much smaller. The cones are more elongated and not as wide as the female cones that bear the seeds, but they're temporary. The male cones are not perennial like the female cones that produce the seeds. I hope that did an answer for your question. I already tried to come up with how many trees grow pine cones, and I just couldn't quite get there. There aren't that many conifers, I can tell you that much. There are very few species left. The conifers have had their age, they've come and gone. There aren't that many conifers left as far as how many species or how many genera. Mangroves, as we saw the photograph of the aerial of Weeden Island, we saw a lot of mangroves, and mangroves have propagules. I've been told that a propagule is not a seed. Is this true? Is it a fruit containing seeds, or is it something else? Mangroves have to be weird. They have to be different. They have a survival mechanism that has served them quite well. Mangroves are a flowering plant. They're not a moss, they're not a fern, they're not a conifer, so they are a flowering plant. All flowering plants produce fruit. So what you see in a mangrove, first you're going to find the flower. The flower is going to get fertilized. The seed is going to form. Then the seed is going to germinate on the plant. And what you see, that propagule, is a germinated seed. Yes, there is a fruit. The seed grew out, the seed germinated inside the fruit, the root grew out of the fruit, and that whole structure was maintained on the tree, the root being even photosynthetic, making some of its own food, getting ready to survive on its own. And when that is ready, that propagule, which is what it's now referred to, drops off, floats off, already started growing as another mangrove plant. So the propagule itself is not a seed, it's a germinated seed. It's a growing plant. The seed has germinated. I hope that gets close. Oh, given the definition of a fruit, aren't all vegetables except root vegetables really fruit? This is where we prevail on our participants to put on a botany hat and wear your botany hat proudly and refer to fruit as the ripened ovary of flowering plants containing the seeds, whether it's a peanut or an avocado or a tomato or one of those things that gets stuck to your socks when you're walking through the grass. Those are fruit. They have two little teeth, bidens, that little stick with the two, yeah, that's a fruit because it's a ripened ovary with a seed inside. Vegetable is not a word that exists in the study of botany. Vegetable is a word that exists in the study of nutrition. Vegetable itself is a subjective word because you could find someone that will disagree with you over whether or not what you've got in your hand is a vegetable or not, whether it's a root or anything. So scientifically speaking, demonstrably, a ripened fruit with seeds inside, a ripened ovary with seeds inside is a fruit. We just have to leave vegetable over there. Where are the hormones located in the plants? Well, they're everywhere. They're throughout. They get dispatched from particular areas to affect other areas. Generally speaking, hormones are produced in meristem, stem tissue, stem cells. Certain tissues, certain organs, leaves, fruits, roots, might have centers of hormone production that are then they can be dispatched to another part of the plant to affect the growth of that part of the plant. We're diving into an area of botanical study called plant physiology, which is all the really interesting chemistry and stuff like that. So yeah, hormones and plant nutrients, those are something that you could spend forever on. So will there be a way to access these visual aids after the program? I am pretty sure that today's program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. A version of Botanical Science for Beginners is currently available on our YouTube channel, which is Pinellas Extension on YouTube. If you go to YouTube, search Pinellas Extension. Pinellas, named for the county, Extension. We are an extension of the University of Florida, Pinellas Extension, and you can find quite a lot of our archived videos there. So even if today's isn't archived there, a version of today's presentation will be there. All right, looks like I've now kept you 14 minutes after. I think that's the last slide. If we have any comments from our hosts, Stephanie, or if Julia wanted to chime in, otherwise we're just going to say good afternoon.
Yeah, no other questions, James. We're good.
All right, great. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and thank you, Stephanie, for introducing us, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks.